They left the three sisters on the edge of the prairie with a note pinned to the eldest's faded dress, a single word scrawled in merciless ink: burden. It was here, where the vast, indifferent sky met the unforgiving dirt of the Montana Territory, that a tired cowboy, riding the fence line of a life carved from loss, first heard a whisper on the wind that was not the grass, a desperate plea of "we don't want to die," before he saw the youngest child, whose hollowed eyes were simply too weak to cry. His name was Elias Thorne, and the dust that settled on his shoulders was no heavier than the silence that had lived in his cabin for 5 long years. He dismounted his horse, the leather of his saddle groaning like a weary soul. The year was 1878, and the autumn air was sharp with the coming promise of a brutal winter. He saw the eldest girl first, standing defiant against the wind, her arms wrapped around a smaller, trembling girl. A third, barely a wisp of a thing, lay curled on a tattered quilt at their feet. Elias's gaze, accustomed to the slow, deliberate movement of cattle and the subtle shift of seasons, took in the scene with a practiced stillness. The girls were wraiths, their faces smudged with dirt and streaked with tears that had long since dried. The eldest, who couldn't have been more than 16, met his eyes. Her own were fierce, a cornered animal's glare, daring him to be the final predator. He saw the note on her chest then, the paper flapping like a broken wing. He didn't need to read it. He understood its language perfectly. It was the language of abandonment, of a world that had no room for the broken or the small. He approached slowly, his hands held open and away from his body, a gesture of peace he'd learned with spooked colts. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice a low rasp, unused to shaping words of comfort. The girl flinched. The one she held, perhaps 10 years old, buried her face in her sister's dress. It was the child on the ground who drew Elias's breath from his lungs. Her small face was a pale, translucent mask, her breathing shallow. Her eyes were open but vacant, staring at a sky she no longer seemed to see. They were wells of sorrow so deep they had run dry. It was a look he knew. He had seen it in the mirror, in the dark hollow of the night, after he'd buried his Sarah. Elias knelt, his knees cracking. He ignored the defiant older sister and looked at the little one. "What's her name?" he asked, his voice softer this time. The eldest hesitated, her jaw tight. "Lily," she finally whispered, the word stolen by the wind. "And I'm Clara." "This is Mary's Lily," Elias repeated, the name a strange and fragile thing on his tongue. He reached out, his calloused, sun-baked hand gently touching Lily's forehead. It was cold. A deep, unnatural cold. A new kind of fear, one he had not felt since the doctor had shaken his head over Sarah's still form, called in his gut. He looked back at Clara. "She needs warmth. A fire." Now there was no argument in his tone, only the flat finality of fact. Clara's fierce gaze wavered, replaced by a flicker of desperate hope. He saw it and stood, his decision made not in his mind, but in some deeper, dust-choked corner of his heart he thought had turned to stone. He gently scooped the little girl, Lily, into his arms. She was weightless, a bundle of brittle bones and threadbare cotton. Her head lolled against his chest, and for a terrifying moment, he thought he was too late. Then he felt it, a faint, fluttering breath against his neck, as fragile as a moth's wing. He looked at Clara and Mary, their wide, haunted eyes fixed on him. "My place is a mile north," he said, his words clipped and certain. "You can walk." Clara nodded numbly, pulling Mary closer. Elias turned and carried Lily to his horse, settling her in front of him, wrapping his own worn coat around her small frame. He did not look back at the place where they were left, at the quilt that marked the grave of their hope. He just rode, the setting sun bleeding orange and purple across the horizon, a bruised and beautiful sky that promised nothing but cold. The silence of his life had been broken, not by a shout, but by the ghost of a breath. The cabin was a single room, built of sturdy pine that had silvered with age, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and a solitude so profound it seemed to have seeped into the very grain of the walls. Elias laid Lily on his own cot, the only bed in the house, and covered her with every blanket he owned. Clara and Mary huddled by the stone hearth, watching him with the wary silence of stray dogs. Clara's hands were clenched around the tattered quilt they had brought with them, its faded patches a map of a life that had been violently unstitched. Elias moved with an economy born of habit, stoking the fire until it roared to life, its light dancing across the shadowed corners of the room and across the girls' pale faces. He put a pot of water on to boil, adding dried meat and the last of his garden potatoes. He did not speak. Words were clumsy tools, and this situation required something finer. He worked, and in his work, he offered them the only promise he knew how to make, the promise of survival. For 2 days, Lily did not wake. Clara sat by the cot, wiping her sister's brow with a damp rag, her young face set in a mask of grim determination. Mary, a silent shadow, clung to Clara's side, her eyes darting from Lily's still form to the large, quiet man who moved around them like a ghost in his own home. Elias slept in the worn rocking chair by the cold window, the chair that had belonged to Sarah. No one had sat in it for 5 years. He would wake with a start in the dead of night, the silence pressing in, and listen for the sound of Lily's breathing, a tiny anchor in the vast, dark ocean of his grief. The narrator's voice, a soft and somber undercurrent, would explain his past. We would see flashes of a smiling woman, her hands covered in flour, the gentle curve of her belly beneath her apron. We would hear the phantom echo of laughter in the silent cabin, the memory of a life that had been full of light and warmth before a fever stole it all, taking both Sarah and their unborn son in a single, cruel blow. Elias had buried them on the hill behind the cabin, beneath the lone pine tree, and with them, he had buried his words, his laughter, his hope. Now, these 3 orphans, cast off by the world, had washed up on the shore of his desolation, bringing with them a storm of feeling he was not prepared for. On the 3rd day, Elias found Clara asleep in her chair, her head slumped forward. He saw the quilt had slipped from Lily's small body. He walked over, his heavy boot silent on the wooden floor, and gently pulled the quilt back up to her chin. As his fingers brushed the worn fabric, he saw the intricate, careful stitches where Clara had mended it time and time again, her needlework a testament to a fierce and stubborn love. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a desperate girl, but a guardian. A survivor. He returned to the hearth and began to carve a piece of scrap wood. His hands, though rough, moved with a surprising grace. Slowly, a small, imperfect shape began to emerge, a bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. Later that afternoon, as the low sun cast long shadows across the floor, Lily stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. They were no longer vacant, but filled with a dazed confusion. She saw Clara first, and a tiny flicker of recognition softened her features. Then her gaze drifted past her sister and settled on Elias, who stood motionless by the window. Fear clouded her eyes. Clara leaned in, whispering reassurances. "It's all right, Lily. We're safe." The word safe hung in the air, a fragile and untested thing. Lily's gaze remained fixed on the tall, bearded stranger. Elias moved then, not toward her, but to the small table beside the cot. He placed the little wooden bird next to her hand and retreated back to the shadows by the window. Lily's eyes followed the bird. Slowly, hesitantly, her small, thin fingers reached out and curled around the smooth wood. She held it to her cheek. For the first time since he had found them, a sound escaped her lips. Not a word, but a soft, contented sigh. A tear, a single, perfect drop of salt water, escaped Clara's eye and traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Elias saw it, and he turned to look out the window, his own eyes burning, at the cold, empty land that suddenly felt a little less lonely. A week bled into a month, and the sharp bite of autumn deepened into the merciless frost of early winter. A routine, unspoken and fragile, began to weave itself into the fabric of their days. Elias would rise before dawn, his quiet movements a signal that the day had begun. He would find coffee brewing and a small portion of oatmeal set out for him, left there by Clara, who now moved about the cabin with a growing, tentative confidence. She was a tireless worker. She swept the floors, mended Elias's worn shirts with stitches as neat as her own, and cooked meals that, while meager, were prepared with a care he had not known in years. She was reclaiming her purpose, not as a burden, but as a creator of a home. Mary, her shyness slowly melting away, began to follow Elias on his chores, a small, bundled-up shadow trailing him to the barn. She would watch, silent and wide-eyed, as he fed the horse and milked the lone cow. He never spoke directly to her, but he started leaving a small stool out for her, and one day, he showed her how to gently stroke the cow's nose. Lily remained the quiet center of their small universe. She was stronger now, able to sit by the fire wrapped in her quilt, the wooden bird always clutched in her hand. But she did not speak. Her silence was a deep well, and no one knew how to draw a single word from it. Then the blizzard came. It descended from the gray, swollen sky without warning, a swirling vortex of white that erased the world. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the window panes and piling snow in great drifts against the cabin door. They were trapped, for souls sealed in a wooden box against the fury of nature. The temperature plummeted. The firewood, which Elias had thought plentiful, began to dwindle at an alarming rate. Fear, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to prickle beneath the surface of their quiet coexistence. On the second day of the storm, one of the calves in the barn went into distress. Elias knew he had to go. Clara watched him bundle himself in every layer he owned, his face grim. "It's a whiteoat," she said, her voice tight with worry. It was the most she had said to him in a week. "Calf will die if I don't," he stated, pulling his hat down low. It was not a discussion. He was gone for hours. The wind shrieked, and the afternoon light faded into a terrifying, premature twilight. Clara paced the small floor, her arms wrapped around herself. Mary sat by the fire, her face pale. Suddenly, Lily began to cough, a dry, rasping sound that shook her small frame. Her forehead was burning. The fever had returned. Panic seized Clara. There was no medicine, no doctor, only the raging storm and the empty space where the quiet man should be. She did what she knew how to do. She bathed Lily's face, whispered stories into her ear, and prayed to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. Just as true darkness fell, the cabin door burst open, and Elias stumbled in, covered in snow, a frozen spectre carrying the limp body of the newborn calf. He was exhausted, his beard encrusted with ice. He collapsed by the hearth, laying the calf on a blanket, and began rubbing its frozen limbs with a desperate energy. He looked up and saw Clara holding Lily, her face a mask of terror. "Fever," Clara choked out. Elias's eyes, weary from his own battle, focused on the small, shivering child. Without a word, he pushed himself to his feet, went to a locked trunk in the corner, Sarah's trunk, and took out a small bottle of horehound and whiskey tonic, the last remnant of his wife's remedies. He knelt by Lily and administered a few drops, his large, rough hand surprisingly gentle as he tilted her head. He and Clara worked together through the night, a silent, seamless team. He kept the fire blazing, using precious wood from the chair he was breaking down, while she tended to Lily. In the grey light of dawn, the storm had broken, and Lily's fever had, too. She was sleeping peacefully, her breath even. The calf, warm and alive, bleated softly by the fire. Exhausted, Elias slumped into what was left of his chair. He looked across the room at Clara, who was asleep in Sarah's rocking chair, her arms still protectively draped over the side of the cot. For years, the sight of anyone near that chair would have sent a shard of ice through his heart. But now, seeing her there, he felt only a profound and aching sense of rightness. He looked at the family that had been shipwrecked in his life, and for the first time, he did not see them as a storm, but as a harbor. Spring arrived like a hesitant apology. The snow receded, revealing a land washed clean, green shoots pushing through the damp, dark earth. Hope, it seemed, was a stubborn root. The rhythm of the ranch returned, but it was a different rhythm now, one punctuated by the sound of Mary's questions and the sight of Lily, now walking and exploring the world just beyond the cabin door. She still had not spoken, but her eyes, once hollow, were now full of a child's quiet curiosity. She would follow Elias, leaving him small treasures she found, a smooth stone, a fallen feather, a wildflower. He would find them on the porch rail and would nod to himself, a silent acknowledgement of their shared, wordless language. Clara had transformed the cabin. Wildflowers sat in a jar on the table. Curtains, fashioned from old flour sacks, now hung in the window. The oppressive silence had been replaced by a hum of life. Elias found himself watching them, a strange warmth spreading through his chest. He was building a new fence one afternoon, the sun warm on his back, when he saw a buggy approaching. It was sleek and black, pulled by a fine horse, an unwelcome sight in this rough-hewn country. A man in a dark suit and bowler hat sat holding the reins. A cold dread settled in Elias's stomach. He knew, even before the man stopped, who he was and why he was here. The man was Silas Croft, the banker from the town 30 miles east, a man whose heart was as cold and hard as the coins he counted. Croft stepped down from his buggy, his polished shoes wrinkling his nose at the mud. His eyes, small and shrewd, swept over the ranch, dismissing it, before landing on Elias. "Thorne," he said, his voice smooth and oily. "I heard you'd taken in some strays if Clara had come to the doorway of the cabin, with Mary and Lily hiding behind her skirts." Croft's eyes flickered towards them, a cruel smile playing on his lips. The Henderson girls. A sad story. Their farm, you see, was heavily mortgaged. An unfortunate turn of events. Elias said nothing. He just stood, his hand resting on a fence post, his knuckles white. "The county has been made aware of their situation," Croft continued, enjoying his power. "Orphaned minors without legal guardianship. They can't stay here. It's not proper. They are to be wards of the state, sent to the orphanage in Helena." Clara let out a small, strangled gasp. The orphanage in Helena was a place of nightmares, a warehouse for forgotten children from which few ever returned whole. "They belong there," Croft said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Where they can be cared for. This is no place for them." He gestured at the humble cabin, the barn, the open land. He was judging Elias's life, his world, and finding it wanting. All the silent, buried rage in Elias, the rage at the war that broke him, the fever that stole his wife, the loneliness that haunted him, began to stir. He looked past Croft, at Clara's terrified face, at Mary's tear-filled eyes, at Lily, who had clutched her wooden bird so tightly her knuckles were white. He looked at the family he had accidentally built, the fragile home they had forged in the ruins of their respective griefs. And he found his voice. "No," Elias said. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. Croft looked taken aback. "I beg your pardon. I said no." Elias took a step forward, away from the fence post. He was taller than Croft, broader, a man shaped by the land itself, not by ledgers and ink. "Their place is here. You have no legal right, Thorne," Croft sneered, his confidence returning. "They are not your blood. Blood ain't what makes a family," Elias said, his voice growing stronger, rougher. "You see a burden. You see an accounting error. I see children who need a home. I see a girl who has fought to keep her sisters alive when the world threw them away. You see charity. I see my family." He took another step, his shadow falling over the smaller man. "They are not going anywhere. They are home. Now get off my land." Croft, for all his bluster, was a coward. He saw something in Elias's eyes then, a line that had been drawn, a frontier of the heart that he did not dare cross. He sputtered, straightened his suit, and retreated to the safety of his buggy. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer, Thorne. This is not over," he shouted as he whipped his horse around and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Elias stood watching until the buggy was a speck on the horizon. He felt a small hand slip into his. He looked down. It was Lily. She was looking up at him, her face tilted to the sun. And then, she spoke. Her first word. "Pa," she said, her voice small and clear as a bell. A crack appeared in the stone wall around Elias Thorne's heart, and through it, the light poured in. The lawyer's letter never came. Silas Croft, it seemed, understood that some battles were not won with paper, but with a conviction he could never hope to match. The threat dissolved like morning mist, leaving behind the clear, bright reality of their new life. That summer, Elias rode into town and visited the circuit judge. He returned not with supplies, but with a piece of paper, official and stamped, that declared Clara, Mary, and Lily Henderson to be the legal wards of Elias Thorne, with the intent of formal adoption. He didn't make a show of it. He simply left the paper on the kitchen table where Clara would find it while she was kneading bread. She saw it, and her hand stilled. She read the words, her eyes tracing the letters of their names, bound now to his. She looked over at Elias, who was mending a harness on the porch, pretending not to notice. Her eyes filled with tears, but these were not the tears of sorrow she had shed for so long. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of a profound and staggering sense of peace. She simply whispered, "Thank you," to the quiet air, and he heard her. Life on the ranch settled into a new, deeper harmony. It was a life built of small, sacred moments. It was Mary, chattering away, telling Elias about the gopher she saw, and Elias listening, truly listening, a small smile touching his lips. It was Clara, humming a soft tune as she worked, the sound filling the cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was Lily, a constant, joyful presence, her laughter finally bubbling up as Elias swung her into the air. One cool evening in late summer, Elias led the three girls up the hill behind the cabin, to the lone pine tree that marked Sarah's grave. He had been dreading this, avoiding it, but he knew it was time. He knelt and cleared the few weeds from the simple wooden cross. "This was my wife's place," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Her name was Sarah. She would have loved you girls very much." He had brought with them a small sapling, a young aspen tree. Together, the four of them dug a hole beside the pine and planted it. Their hands, large and small, worked together, patting the earth around the fragile roots. It was a joining of two stories, of a love that was lost and a love that was found, a promise that new life could grow in the shadow of grief. Winter came again, but this time it was not a threat. It was a season of togetherness. On Christmas morning, the girls awoke to find 3 gifts by the hearth. For Mary, a new leather-bound journal and a pencil. For Clara, a bolt of soft blue calico fabric. And for Lily, a beautifully carved horse, a perfect companion for her little bird. They had a gift for him, too. A scarf, knitted with clumsy, earnest stitches in a riot of mismatched yarn. He wrapped it around his neck and did not take it off for the rest of the day. He looked at them, his girls, their faces glowing in the firelight, and the hole in his heart, the one that had gaped open for 5 long years, felt full. Years passed. The sapling grew tall and strong, its leaves whispering to the pine. The cabin gained a new room, built by Elias and his helpers, Mary and Lily. Clara became a young woman, her spirit gentle but unbreakable, the heart of their home. The tired cowboy was no longer tired. The stoic protector had found what he was protecting was not just 3 orphan sisters, but his own reborn heart. The quiet ranch on the edge of the Montana prairie had become more than a place of survival. It had become a testament to the enduring truth that family is not something you are born into, but something you build, stitch by stitch, with courage, kindness, and unwavering love. If this story stirred your heart and reminded you that even in the deepest silence, a cry for help can be heard, and that a broken family can be mended by a stranger's compassion, then please consider joining our community. We believe in the power of stories to inspire and heal. Subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support allows us to continue telling stories about the quiet heroes and the resilient souls who prove that the greatest treasures are not made of gold, but of love.